there was very little warning for this incident, and those passengers who weren't belted up, they went straight through. Their heads went up into, where you have the overhead lockers inside the cabin interior, where you have your light, your little light you can adjust, and where there's an
Yeah.
air vent. That their heads hit that, and because even if you're seated, if you're not necessarily moving around the cabin and you're not belted up, that's going to be the first point of impact. And so head injuries are obviously very serious.
Now, one person has died and several others have been injured after turbulence on a Singapore Airlines flight from London. The Boeing 777 dropped 6,000 feet within a few minutes, according to flight tracking data. The airline has apparently offered its condolences. Let's talk to Sally Gethin. She is a travel and aviation expert. Welcome to the show, Sally.
Oh, thank you.
Tell us what the latest news is that you might have heard.
Well, one thing I'm hearing from a good source is that it was the passengers that weren't belted up in their seats that suffered the injuries. So sadly, there's a fatality, but there are 30 other people who were also injured. And what seems to have happened, according to another passenger on the plane, was that there was very little warning for this incident, and those passengers who weren't belted up, they went straight through. Their heads went up into, where you have the overhead lockers inside the cabin interior, where you have your light, your little light you can adjust, and where there's an
Yeah.
air vent. That their heads hit that, and because even if you're seated, if you're not necessarily moving around the cabin and you're not belted up, that's going to be the first point of impact. And so head injuries are obviously very serious. But if it was somebody who was moving around the cabin, then of course that's much worse, because they can go straight up into the top of the fuselage. The way the gravity works is that there's almost a floating sensation, unless everything has to be bolted down, and anything that isn't is going to move suddenly. But it is extremely, extremely rare to have a fatality like this. I mean, I've been, investigating and covering aviation stories for decades now, and I have not heard of a death due to turbulence. But having said that, there's an increase in turbulence in general, and that's due to climate change and global warming. It's to do with the jet streams that go from west to east across the globe. And so, unfortunately, it's going to be something of an occupational hazard when you're flying, increasingly.
It is interesting, that, isn't it? I mean, it's an awful thing to have happened, but it's interesting to hear you say that it's almost unheard of, considering how long you've been covering airlines for. And we have all, I'm sure, experienced turbulence. And those of us who might feel casual about the wearing of a seatbelt when the seatbelt warning sign goes on will think again. Given what you said, which does strike one as something that happened almost instantly. I mean, normally the captain will get on the line and say, we're going to experience turbulence. We're heading into turbulence. You've got to put your seatbelt on. But this sounds like it might have happened almost instantaneously.
Yeah, I think, having done a lot of long haul flying myself, I think that you're right when you said about the captain will warn you. That's because there's onboard radar that can detect say, raindrops in the distance, can detect some atmospheric changes. And normally they will plan for things. They'll be in communication with air traffic control to make altitude adjustments. They'll want to fly above it or around it if they know in advance. But you do get these thermal pockets that will suddenly appear, and sometimes it's to do with also the topography. So if you're mountains can cause thermals above them. It seems that this airplane was coming in off the Andaman Sea into the archipelagos there in that part of the Asia Pacific region. I don't know whether or not that might have played a part as well, but it maybe have coming into a different
Yes, it's interesting.
atmospheric condition.
It's interesting you'll talk about climate change as well. Do you think airlines will start having to think about changing some of the routes that they take, the long haul routes that they take, because of changes to the jet stream?
I think that's highly unlikely. They tend to use the jet streams to their advantage. It tends to propel the aircraft forward. But when you imagine a plane is basically like a tube and it's cutting through a stream which is wider than it.
Mm.
So that's going to cause some disruption anyway. Like I say, those jet streams can work in their favour and propel the aircraft along. Nothing that a passenger would be particularly aware of, but it helps with, schedules. And we're not yet at that stage where we've got like aircraft like Concorde would fly very high,
Yes,
into the atmosphere, into like 45,000
feet.
feet
Yeah.
or above. So we're not doing that yet, although that will eventually come in decades to come. But
Oh,
I
yes, of
think
course. When we take the 20-minute flight from London to Sydney, turbulence will be a thing of the past when we kind of fly
or
into space. But
suborbital or
suborbital.
orbital,
Sally
yeah.
Gethin, the travel and aviation expert, thank you for coming on at short notice to talk about the tragedy that a poor passenger was killed due to turbulence on a Singapore Airlines flight from London.
Other news now, a passenger has been killed and 30 others injured on a flight from London to Singapore that was hit by severe turbulence. The Singapore Airlines plane was diverted to Bangkok and landed around 3:45 p.m. local time, about 9:45 this morning here. The airline said in a statement that it offered its deepest condolences to the family of the deceased. Well, we can speak now to Terry Tozer, a former airline pilot who now writes about aviation safety. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is pretty extraordinary because lots of people were thinking about how serious can turbulence be. Explain for us how unusual it is that it's so serious that a passenger's lost their life.
Well, very unusual. I can't recall an incident where somebody's actually died before, or at least not in the last few years. If everybody is strapped into their seats, they should be pretty safe. But if they're not, then obviously, if the aircraft were to drop suddenly, then they can be effectively thrown upwards and hit the ceiling or hit the bins overhead. And it is, or if they're standing, of course, it would be the same. So, I mean, that would be pretty dangerous, but it's obviously very unusual.
And when you are a pilot, how much notice can you have in terms of knowing that you might be, there might be some turbulence up ahead, and what can you do to try and avoid it?
Well, I mean, in the absence of detection systems, which are being developed, I mean, as a general rule, everybody tries to help out. You'll get aircraft that are saying we're encountering turbulence at this such and such a position. Air traffic control will pass that information on. You get weather reports that indicate where areas of turbulence are likely to be. You normally get a little bit of warning anyway, so things start to shake about a little bit. And if you feel that it's developing, then you'll put the seatbelt signs on nice and early and get everybody sat down and strapped in. You can, in very rare circumstances, suddenly hit some severe turbulence without much warning. And obviously that's where it could be dangerous. That may well be what happened this time, but obviously we don't really know at this stage.
And what causes turbulence? This is my complete ignorance. I mean, you're obviously an expert.
Well, I mean, it's usually what's referred to as wind shear. I mean, at high altitude, you get winds blowing in various different directions, and where they conflict with one another, they tend to churn the air up, and jet streams and things like that can generate it. And the weather forecast will note on the chart that you pick up when you report for work, and it will say, these are likely areas, but they could stretch over hundreds of miles, and so you need to be a bit more specific. And so, it is basically weather phenomena.
And it's had such tragic consequences in this case. Terry, good to speak to you. Thank you for that. Terry Tozer, a former airline pilot, now writes about aviation safety.